Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the IMIS lecture series. I'm Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. We are delighted to have Hagar Kotef here with us today to talk about her book, The Colonizing Self, or Home and Homelessness in Israel, Palestine, which was published by Duke University Press last year. Dr. Kotef is the professor in political theory and comparative political thought at SOAS in the University of London. And her research interests are political theory, Israel-Palestine, settler-colonialism, feminist theory, and liberalism and its critiques. Her previous book, Movement and the Ordering of Freedom, charts the conceptual history of mobility and immobility in the history of political thought and the structuring of political spaces from the writings of Locke, Hobbes, and Mill to the sophisticated technologies of control that circumscribe the lives of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Thanks so much, Hagar, for joining us today from London, right? Our guest will be in conversation with our very own GW Libby Anker, who is Associate Professor of American Studies and Political Science at GW, and she's also the director of the Film Studies program. And her research and teaching is at the intersection of political theory and cultural studies with a focus on practices of freedom, violence, and power in US politics and culture. She's the author of Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama and the Politics of Freedom, and forthcoming Ugly Freedoms. And her articles have appeared in numerous journals and political theory, social research, theory and event, politics and gender, contemporary political theory, and so on. And we are just so delighted to have Libby join us today and to put you two in conversation on the colonized self. So thank you to both of you for joining us. The format of today's event is a conversation between Libby and Hagar, and we'll go for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And the questions can go in the chat at any time. And Shayna Marshall, who's the Associate Director of the Institute, is responsible for monitoring the questions in the chat and moderating the Q&A portion of today. Just before we start, I want to thank Christian Clinton, our operations manager, and Elad Raymond, our events coordinator, for all of their hard work to make this happen. And thanks for joining us. Libby, I'm going to pass the floor to you. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Mona. And I'm delighted to be here virtually at IMIS, and especially to have the chance to talk with Hagar Kotef, whose work has been really influential for my own. Many of my ideas in Ugly Freedom have actually stemmed from her work and ideas on freedom and her own challenges and discussions on my work over many years now. So it's a real pleasure for me to get the chance to talk with Hagar about her newest work. So let's begin, and we'll think about the colonizing self. The colonizing self is a major intervention into scholarship in settler colonialism, scholarship on Israel-Palestine, and political subjectivity. I should also make a note that I'm in a reading group that I know some people here are a part of with faculty, and we often read books that are really influential, and we usually have deep disagreements about all of them. And I think this was the one book that we all loved over the last few years, except for maybe Saidiya Hartman. So I just want to say, to be able to get all of us to, really engage in the book is a feat in and of itself. And one of the things we were really interested in, and I think is crucial to the key moment of the books, is its intervention in questions of home, right? On the study of home, on what does it mean to create and to live in a home, even a home that is kind of loving and warm, but that is built on violence, destruction, and stolen land, right? And as you know, you're not interested particularly in the violence that can happen within the home per se, but on the very construction of home in settler societies as a technology of violence. So I really am just asking this to open it up to how you can explain the relationship between home and violence in settler societies.
Thank you, Libby. And if I may start by thanking Mona and Arya, who I cannot see, but invited me here, and say how much I am happy to be in conversation here with you in particular, because everything you said, I can say back at you. So I think it's a conversation that has inspired us both. It's weird that I find this question very difficult to answer, maybe because after writing this book, it all seems so obvious to me that I don't have anything to say anymore. And I tend to always start answering from the point where I ended writing, which is very bad practice because no one else understands what I'm saying. So I'll try to go to the basics and say it, but if it's insufficient, just like redirect me. So I think at the very basic level, right, what we have with settler colonialism is an organized migratory movement that is different, and right, and this is Veracini and Wolf have taught us that it's different from other migratory movements because the migrants do not come to join a society and its structures and its laws and its political communities and organizations, but rather to change and replace and inhabit the law themselves. It's also different from other migrant societies because it's very much invested in practices and symbolism and rhetoric of stability. So at stake is the indigenization, right, of the settler, the erasure, right, of the fact that they have immigrated. Now, I should say this and immediately add a reservation because it would be different, right, in different settler societies and even in different moments of the same society. So the US, for example, right, can pride itself for being a migratory society at the same time that it is invested in practices of white nationalism that are very much dependent, right, upon the ability to, or at least partly dependent upon the ability to erase some of these migratory facets of the society, right, because it's about white indigeneity in a way in the land. But generally, I guess what we can say that as the very name proposes, right, settler colonialism is about settlement, about creating homes for the settlers. But since it's also about replacement, right, this home building process is about pushing colonized out of their homes and replacing them not just out of their concrete home and concrete land, but also out of their status of the indigenous people of the land, right? So it's a double act of removal and displacement, which means in a way that to tell the story of settler colonialism is to tell the story of homes that are tools of destruction, but also to tell the stories of all these other homes that are being destroyed, and ideally not in the way that only sees destruction, right, but that sees beyond destruction and beyond ruination into everything else that also remains. So I guess that what the book tries to show is that both very concretely and materially, but also metaphorically or symbolically, settler colonialism is an act of living inside someone else's house, someone else's home, right? A home that has thereby been destroyed. And I guess when we say this, we should separate between two modes or types or levels of violence, right? There is the original act of displacement, right? The original act of invasion, though I think we can rethink maybe later about both this idea of origin and about invasion, right? Both of them are problematic. And here, I guess, right, maybe constitutive violence would actually be better, right? So there is the constitutive violence of settler colonialism, and here the violence is very much direct, right? It is about the physical displacement, the physical quarantining, the physical expulsion of indigenous people. But as Patrick Wolf taught us, settler colonialism is not, right, the historical moment of invasion, it's a structure, right? And in this sense, also the following generations take part, right, in also the following generation which did not take part in this constitutive act of violence are still somehow inhabit this violence in ways we can maybe discuss later.
Great, that actually leads to my second question, right? About what are the selves that are being constructed in this violence, you know, in this moment of home, right? And you examine how homemaking constructs a particular self, especially in settler societies, which is the title of your book, right? The Colonizing Self. And also how subjects and selves are crafted in relationship to the state violence that brings their home into being. And you call it, I think really provocatively and helpfully, a theory of the dispossessing subject, right? What is a subject that is crafted through the act of dispossessing? And as you say, dispossession doesn't happen once, but it's happening over and over, an iterative dispossession. You write that you're interested in selves who might not be direct agents of settler harm, right? So maybe not the initial people involved in removal, but people who cannot or will not redress the violence that their homemaking creates, even when they are confronted by it, right? And one of the things I found most provocative and challenging about the book is your argument that sometimes when an identity and when a home space is constructed out of this settler violence, it becomes very hard to divest from that violence, right? Right, even for the, the most well-intentioned critics. Or what do you do when your whole notion of what does it mean to have a home, to live at home, to be a person who lives at this home is constructed on violence, right? How do you, to separate from that violence is to kind of, undo the subject in a sense. So I'm just wanted to hear more, if you could elaborate on the relationship between the violence of settler homemaking and the sense of self that is crafted through this violence.
Yes, I think you just put it really well in the last sentence, right? In which to completely disavow this violence, to completely divorce oneself from this violence, not by saying it's not me, but by recognizing that it is me, and yet refuse to continue be part of it. What's at stake is the very undoing of the subject. And this is why I think it's so impossible, right, to overcome this. And this is not just a thing about settler colonialism, think about capitalism, right? Think about the price that would be if we want to undo, right, the capitalist system completely. What would it mean if we recognize the amount of violence that is invested in us being homeowners, right? Or homeowners in particular neighborhoods, in particular cities. What would it mean to give it up? How much people would be inclined to actually do this, even when they are, right, great socialists and Marxists? The actual price is sometimes too much to pay. And in this sense, I guess we can think of settler colonialism as a vast project of real estate, as a vast project of constructing houses, because in a way, this is what it is. But of course, it's not just this, right? As you said, it's also about senses of belonging and selfhood, and the notion of home, the concept of home that kind of is tethered throughout this book, seeks to tie these two together, right? The space, the taking space, which is the taking the place of another, but also the sense of self that is being constructed and that emerges through this act of taking place. There is an anecdote that I came across unfortunately after writing the book, but I think it demonstrates really well what it means to be such a subject. And it's about Yigal Allon, Yair Volach, some of us know, recently shared it with me. So Yigal Allon was the commander of the Palmach before 48, and then was a leader in the Israeli military and a member in the Labour Party. And when he died, in one of the eulogies, someone described him as a man who truly, truly loved the land, truly, truly loved the territory, how he knew each and every path, how he would walk around and enjoy like the trees and the flowers. And it went on and on with like this lyrical elaboration of love to the place. And what he used to do, so says the eulogy, is to go around these paths he loved so much and then bend down and grab a piece of soil and eat it. Now, I don't know if Yigal Allon really used to eat pieces of land, but I think it is telling, right, that we can tell the story of this love, right? A love that in his case was very, very explicitly and directly tethered with the act of displacing Palestinians and military violence. But we can tell the story of this love only through this metaphor of consumption, right? Right, destroying in a way the love the land that one loves so much, right? By trying to make it part of who one is, but in so doing, take it away, destroy it completely. And I think this is the type of relation, I guess, that I'm trying to get at in the book.
I mean, there's also something so interesting about the ingestion right? Literally of reconstituting a self through this land, right? That one loves, right? Kind of act of destruction and then reconstitution in a body that then gets to kind of control the land. That's a great metaphor.
And there is indeed like a path in the book, right? So it starts with Locke as trying to capture this idea of consumption, right? Of an individual self that emerges through this almost digestion of everything as a form of property making. Yeah. And it ends right with an episode about MasterChef, in which you have a settler from like a recently evicted outpost, who basically in various and very different ways keeps eating Palestine, right? He eats the symbolism of Palestinian food. He eats Jerusalem in the form of some dessert that he makes at the end and explodes. So I think there is something about digestion, right? That goes throughout in this notion of selfhood that is in so many ways violent.
It also connects to the fact that there's not just this one moment, but right, if you're constantly eating and digestion, right, it's a constant cycling through. Also, great. I wanted to talk some specifics, which you go through in the book, which is the kind of specifics of this colonizing self and the way it plays out in Israel and Palestine. So say your book focuses on the dispossessing subject primarily in Israel, Palestine, especially, although it's found in other settler societies as well, and I'll ask about that a little bit later on. But you particularly examine the way in which a lot of the collective identities of Israeli Jews are shaped by living through and amidst the destruction of Palestinian homes and ways of homemaking. And you do not homogenize the Israeli Jewish experience, but you lead us through different iterations of this experience and different types of subjects and different sectors of Israeli society. So I'm wondering if you can give us some of those examples, some of which are incredibly rich in the book, of different ways in which this plays out, and different subjects that are being formed in their different, kind of relationships to the violence that they are creating.
I'm not sure I can do it justice now, because it's once you move from the theory and the structure to the history and its various details, then you need to take time to untether those. And I'm not sure I even do it well enough in the book, right? So the book works through figures rather than through real people. Even when it does talk about real people, they function in the book as kind of archetype of something. But I guess like within the many different positionalities and forms of relations, right, to different facets of violence, I guess there is a dual matrix, so like a 2-1-2 matrix within which we can kind of situate these different subjects. One has to do with thinking about active or direct or eventful violence, right? Violence in the making versus structural violence, or violence as, right, as the ongoing, lingering violence that permeates every aspect of this settler society and territory. So the violence in the making, the settlement in the making, versus what Michael Rothberg called, right, the implicated subject, right, the subject who may not participate directly in violence, but that is nevertheless conditioned upon the structures of violence that allow them to be who they are. And in this case, right, there are two main figures in the book that represents these two subject positions. One is a fictive figure called Irit, who is a leftist Israeli who lives in a depopulated who lives in a depopulated Palestinian house in Jaffa. So she is the figure of this implicated subject. And the other is Avri Ran, who is called in the book something, I don't remember how I called him eventually, something Golan, who has become, right, a symbol of settler violence in Israel. And in this sense, the divide is also the divide between 67 and 48, right? Between a project that has been to some degree completed and a project that is still ongoing. but this divide and the way I just now characterized it is also highly problematic, right? So it's even 48 and 67 are for me analytical figures more than concrete realities in the land, because concrete acts of ongoing settlement and destruction go within the 48 borders all the time as well, right? And there is forms of normalization and implication also among settlements in the West Bank. So it's all kind of analytical separations that once you dig into them, you see that they're much more in flow into one another. And then the second element of this dual matrix is the separation between those who fully enjoy the fruit of settlement and those marginalized subjects within the settler society, whose ability to enjoy, right, the fruit of the loot, right, of the land theft is limited and questioned all the time. And we know that in all settler societies, right, you'd have, it's not just about the settler-native divide, it's also about divides within each of these societies alongside class and ethnic lines. So in this case, it's mostly the divide between Mizrahi Jew and Ashkenazi Jews, and their form of relations and access, right, to the stability or instability that home provides.
Great. Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the 48-67 divide, in part because I think your description of the colonizing self actually challenges how people want to imagine that divide as something justified versus unjustified, or fair or righteous versus unfair and unrighteous, when also, there's something, you're certainly not arguing that everything is just one blob of sameness, but that kind of easy distinction that people want to make, you make it more difficult. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
I have to honestly say that at least part of this is not my doing. It's what the paradigm of settler colonialism does for us, right? So I have many issues with the paradigm, and I'm happy to chat about them as well. But I think that the good thing about it is precisely that it allows us to see the project as a whole, the Zionist project as a whole, right, as a settler project. Now, this as well needs to be problematized. And I saw in the audience Yuval Ivri, with whom I recently wrote something precisely to question this, and to see whether we could have modes of immigration, of Jewish immigration to the land, that are not of a settler structure. But the way history happened, rather than like what we can imagine that could have happened, is that the modes of presence of Jewish immigration, right, to Palestine took the structures that we recognize very well from this paradigm of settler colonialism. And in this case, the only difference is, right, between what has been established, right, and what is still in the making. But I think we can see these movements back and forth in many ways. So recently, in the recent, the last of the many circles of violence in Gaza, what we could see is two things. First, 48 Palestinians joined, right, the Palestinian call in ways that they haven't before, right, destabilizing the separation that what's happening in 48 is different than what happens in 47. They also started calling the people in Haifa and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv the settlers. And I have many Palestinian friends from the diaspora who told me that they could not understand at the beginning, right, how come the Jews, the non-settlers Jews, are being referred to as settlers, because this has been, I think, right, like thinking with settler colonialism allowed us to do this. But what also happened at this time is that settlers from the West Bank, right, came to inside 48, right, to Haifa and to Lydia and to the other mixed cities, in order to take part in the violence. And this was not the first time they came there. They actually joined what we can only call actual settlements in these mixed cities that have been going on for quite some time. They're called Garinim Toranim in Hebrew. I don't know how to call them in English, like kernels of I don't know, whatever. It's basically, right, this idea that there is like a small settlement, a small urban settlement inside the mixed city that is there to assure and secure Jewish presence. Now, these are forms of taking place, right? Form of constructing a home that were taken directly from what we see in the West Bank into 48. So I think we see like different processes that destabilize this division. Maybe there was a time in which the division between 48 and 67 and what is okay and what is not okay could have been imagined towards the future, right? So as in there will be two states and the Palestinian state would be in the 67 boundaries. So the future would then retrospectively qualify 48 because of the Palestinian future in 67. But this is no longer the case. We're no longer talking about a future of two states. So we need to think within the one state option and how we think about the modes of being there, but also, right, the violence that it entails.
Thank you for that. This also leads to my next question, which is to ask about like the, if not the normative underpinning of the project, but kind of what you are asking for from the dispossessing subject. And I know that's a hard question, but you write in the book, right, this, you argue that part of the work of the book was to refuse a gap between state violence and the people who make up the state, right? Even and especially those who critique the state for its violence, even as they're a part of a world. And you write, this refusal is not an act of erasing these distinctions. It is a form of taking responsibility for what we have done, or for what was and is done in our name, or for all the destruction and violence whose fruits we still enjoy. So I'm wondering if this is kind of, you know, what is your call after this analysis in a certain way? You know, what does this responsibility taking consist of? Is maybe a more precise way to ask it.
So I have an easy answer and another answer that is probably not an answer. The easy answer is that the people I have in mind, the community I have in mind when I say these things, is the vast majority of the Israeli left, which is still very much clinging to these separations, the very separation between the 67 and the 48, right? The separation between us who want peace and just want to live quiet, normal life and make sure that our children don't go to serve in the military, and them, which can be the settlers or the government or the state or the right or those who support Netanyahu or whatever, right? But the us of the Israeli left is presumably, right, the okay side in this equation of okay and not okay. But actually, if you look at left government in Israel, the vast majority of the prime minister who built the most settlements in the West Bank was Ehud Barak. It wasn't someone from the right? So, and the vast majority of people in like the bourgeoisie left in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, I think would not be willing to pay the price, right? That a full justice solution entails. And so the easy answer is that I want to look at these people and tell them you are part of the problem. So this is the easy answer. The difficult answer is that I'm part of the problem as well, right? So it's not like looking at some other community. Now I just mark the line in a different place. So it's not just the right, it's also the Israeli Zionist left, but I am fine. I am not fine as well, right? This is an autobiographical book in so many ways. It's about me, my childhood, my dad, right? My friends. And here I'm less sure what it is that I am calling or asking for. I don't have like an easy solution. I don't have a prescription for policymaking. So I think it's a first step, right? So it's about first recognizing and seeing what it is that it means to be who we are. But it's also another ask, right? So it's not just about me or my friends or like Israelis at large recognizing, or settlers, right, in general, in the US as well, recognizing who we are. It's also about another ask for recognition, which is to say, but nevertheless, this is our home, right? So in your first question, you talked about this like divide between a home that is a place of love and affection and kinship, and I don't remember what you said, but is also a site of violence. And I guess I want to hold on to these two places in which it's not about, so the one thing I do not ask, sorry, I think it's my cat fighting with another cat outside. Just 1 second.
We will happily pause for
Sorry,
cat,
no, here.
on cat
Okay,
violence or whatever's happening.
She kicked the other cat. Oh, okay, I'll ignore that. So the one thing it's not a call for is for all Jews to pack up their suitcases and go somewhere else, right? Because I don't think it's viable. I don't think I did that, right? But not everyone can do that. So it's not, I don't think it's a sustainable political solution. So there is a dual ask here from basically everyone to recognize their place, but also the other's place and the relation between self and other in this like act of displacement. And I don't know, maybe start a conversation from there.
You know, you have a epigraph of Said, and I think, you know, that's the quote, you know, that also seems to be guiding this. Great. Yeah, I mean, I actually had a question of how you came to the project, because the book, there are personal moments in the book. So you already have addressed that a little bit. I'm not sure if you want to address that anymore.
You mean how I came to this as kind of a sociology of writing question?
Yeah, yes.
So I was in the States for quite some time. And then in 2012, and when you are right in the States, it's very easy. You're far away, you can make critiques, you can say everyone is not okay. Right? From afar, it's very difficult to form solid, clean, neat political critiques. But then 2012, I moved back to Israel. And I think then it became very clear to me that it doesn't work. And that there is something about this that requires addressing in different way. And I guess in some sense, the book is a struggle of trying to find the ways of addressing this messiness, right? Of what it means when justice cannot be so clear-cut and beautiful and obvious. Yes, so I guess it's the bit.
Great. I have a question that you don't specifically address. I mean, you mentioned, but I think given that, you know, a lot of us are listening from the US, I wanted to bring your study of home to our home in DC. And I'm wondering how you see the creation of a colonizing self in American identity, right? Which is obviously another settler society that entails homemaking on the ruins of indigenous lands and lives. And in some part, because early moments of settler colonialism were so in the past, you know, it's easier in the US to imagine that this is part of a prehistory rather than an ongoing action, which I think you would, you know, insist that we think through. So I'm wondering, how might you see an American dispossessing self be both like and different from the colonizing self that you're looking at in Israel, Palestine?
So I guess structurally it's the same thing. And this takes us back maybe to the first question and the need to move right between the structural and the particular, between the historical and the theoretical maybe. And maybe also an opportunity to reflect for a moment about this like paradigm of settler colonialism, which is so obsessed with like taking these few examples and say, right, Israel, US, Canada, Australia, they're all the same. So they're not all the same, even though structurally they're very similar. And it seems to me that the two crucial differences nonetheless between them have to do with space and time. So so space has to do with the fact that Israel is very, very, very small. And because it is very, very small, one is confronted by the violence constantly, right? Both the violence of the now and the traces of the violence of the then. And so there is an intimacy, right, that emerges from the very relation to the land, to the territory, that is already somehow linked, right, to this form of violence. And maybe this is a better answer to your previous question, actually, because part of what made me start thinking about this book is when I returned to Israel, is the places that made me feel like, oh, I'm back, were when I went to the West Bank, and or when I went back to where I was born, and there is like this destroyed Syrian village basically right next to the village where I was born. And this is where I used to play, right? This is where I used to hide up in the hide and seek with other kids, where we used to go and have picnics. So it's these piles of stones that used to be someone else's home, right? That for me kind of provoked the sense of, oh, I'm back home. And I think this intimacy that so many of us who grew up in Israel feel is something that is very different than someone who lives in Washington, right? And does not need to constantly see, right, these traces of violence. They do not become constitutive of the self in the same way that I think they do in Israel. So this is space. And in terms of time, I think that right, even though we can all say that settler colonialism cannot be reduced to this original act of invasion, and again, I'm not comfortable with these terms, because invasion assumes, right, that both the societies and the territories were there as a given before the act of invasion, right? So we have a territory, we have one society that is in the territory, we have another society that enters in, and actually, I think both societies and the boundaries of the territories are historically often a function, right, of the histories of colonization. But let's put it aside. So even though, right, settler colonialism cannot be reduced to that moment, right? Settler societies are dynamic and they change, and maybe they change more than any other society because they are migratory societies, right? And I think that over time, the relation between anyone, right, and the act of settlement on its direct violence changes. So those who arrive to the land or were born in the land 3 generations after have a different relation, right? Not just a different relation to violence, as if violence can be thought of in the singular, but they have different relations to different facets of violence, to different forms of violence than the first generation, and certainly after 10 generations or 15 generations. So even though we have here a structure, and structurally, I think they are the same, the question of individual and personal, maybe not responsibility, but positionality, right, and senses of selfhood vis-a-vis this violence changes. And I say changes, but does not disappear, right? So we keep having a tension between the structure of settlement, in which we're all implicated and embedded, and the details and the histories that must be, right, thoughts in their specificities. So yeah, I would say it's the same, but
Right. Same but different.
Yes, exactly.
I actually have one more question. I'm wondering if I have time for that, or if we should open it up for questions from the audience.
We are getting some questions in the chat, but if it's a short one, I think you have time.
Okay, this will be my last one, and I guess a 2-second question and a 1-minute answer. I am wondering if you have seen, in thinking through the kind of construction and the living out process of dispossessing selves, any example or intimation of dispossessing selves that kind of become undone or reconstruct themselves in relationship to violence once they kind of see it or acknowledge it, or take it within themselves? Is there a sense where taking in and or recognition of this kind of violence internally has ever kind of undone a sort of colonizing self? Maybe that's a hard question to throw at you for the last one, but here we are.
Yes. I think, okay, so I think this allows me to answer better one of your previous questions. This is what I want to do eventually, right? I want to achieve some sense of undoing, right? I know, again, as like a semi-autobiographical book, I know when I'm being confronted by this violence, I am often being undone. And what bothers me often is the peacefulness by which other can either go on living or kind of resume, right? So there is a moment of, oh my God, this is like horrible, how can this be? And like 5 minutes after that, it's gone. And it doesn't do anything fundamental to one's identity or sense of self or entitlement to the place or whatever. So I think there are people who are being undone. And in a way, the question at stake, and I think this is the question of decolonization, if we want to understand it, right, not as the settlers go away, but as finding other ways in which the two sides can inhabit the land together, is how we undo and redo the settler subject as a non-settler subject, right? As an immigrant, perhaps, as someone who can be an equal rather than right on top. But it seems to me, and this is part of the main like intervention of the book, I guess, that the effort to undo people by showing them or telling them as if the power of the truth will do this work for us, this doesn't work. I think the more we try to do this, and this is what like many of us like in critical theory and politics have tried to do, is to like shove people. I've been teaching Plato today, and there is the moment in which Socrates asks someone like, do you want me to pour this argument into your soul? And the guy says, no, please don't. Like, this is what we've been trying to do, right? To pour the truth into people's soul, assuming that this would undo them. And I guess what people do with this truth, historically, when I look at Israel at least, and I think when we look at Trump, this is what we see, right? Is that people actually accept and embrace and entrench in this positionality of the dispossessor, of the violent. And they just like, this removes so many of the limitations that the non-truth allow, right? That the need to hide and deny have put into place. So I don't know what should substitute this. But I think that the simple truth cannot undo people. I think we need to think about like a factual rather than rational levels. Art can undo people, maybe.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everyone for your questions in the chat. Please enter those now if you have them. If it's okay, Hagar, I'll go ahead and give you a couple questions and then you can respond to them, and then we'll collect some more. One question is about Ilian Pape's work that is cited in your book, and about how, whether or not you think those are still credible given critiques of his methodology. Another question is about definition of terminology that you use in your book, such as indigeneity, settler, and Zionist. The next question is, if you can talk a little bit about how Israelis continuously self-colonize, working to pass as white and Western, and how that identity itself is enabled through colonialism and the dispossession of Palestinians.
Okay, many difficult questions to answer. With Ilian Pape, I think I'm using only the parts of his work that have been qualified by other scholars. And the reason I use him rather than others in these moments is that basically the book tries to do two things at one and the same time. And partly these two things operate between the text and the footnotes. So the footnotes try to give you like a long history of what for this now I will call Zionism, but there is the other question of how I use this terminology. So we will probe this in a second. But a long history of Zionism, of settlement, of the project, and so it needs to be quick and concise. And Pepper has this quality in him, but I'm almost 100% sure that each and every detail that I use from him is also used by others and has been qualified by others historians. So some of the things he said have been disqualified, but I think not the ones I'm using. In terms of the terminology, I think it goes back to this tension, right, between theory and history, between the structure and the actual detailing of what happens in various societies. And I use indigeneity and settlement in the same way that I use the figures of, say, Irit and Aviram, right? I use them as placeholders. I think each and every one of them needs to be questioned, right? But they do a certain work for me in this particular book. And I should say again that I've questioned them elsewhere. So it's not that I say they need to be questioned and I leave it at that. I did the work of questioning them. But in the book, because that it is a book about homemaking, right? And because it's a book about settlement in this regard, then the figure of the settler as a figure, right, is really important for me. Even though, right, and there are moments in the book where I say, sometimes in some cases, the paradigm of settler colonialism does not fully fit what I want to say. Sometimes paradigms of partition, right, of national revival would be better to explain what it is that I want to explain. But there is like this lyrical idea of the figure of the settler, settlement, making a home, right, that does this work. And again, Zionism is the same, right? Zionism is the placeholder, right, for explaining a particular attitude to the land. And precisely, I use it in order to gesture toward the possibility, right, of a Jewish presence in the land that is not, or that takes a different form than the one that it historically took. So, and I guess once one digs into the details, and in some moments of the book I do this, but in a way the span of the book is so wide and it is more about the structures than about the histories, that I can only do it momentarily and mostly in the footnotes. So once one digs into each of these moments, right, all of these concepts can be undone. And nevertheless, I think they're important in order for us to understand some political structures. There was another question that I now forgot.
Yes, it was about self-colonization, passing as white and Western, and how that is used, or how that's enabled by the dispossession of Palestinians.
This is really interesting because I think we see two very opposite trajectories, and we see them constantly and all the time. One is precisely this, like, Westernization of the land, of the people, right? Israel as being, right, part of Europe, part of the West, Israel as, like, Tel Aviv as a white city, right? But we also see constantly the opposite trajectory, right, in which people seek to actually indigenize themselves by becoming part of the Middle East, right? So the appropriation of food, right? So we eat pita and we eat hummus and these, like, adoption of Mizrahi identity as, like, a cultural asset in many ways, which weirdly does the same thing, right? So we have these two opposite trajectories that both seek to eventually achieve the entrenchment of Jews in the land. And part of what I show in the book is this dual movement in regard to houses, because it's a book about homes and houses, right? And how we have, on the one hand, this, like, architectonic trajectories that seek to build the land as a Western land, right, as non-Mediterranean, as non-Middle Eastern, Bauhaus that is brought from Germany, etc. And on the other hand, right, the real estate value of the Arab house, right, and this tendency to build, right, with arches and Jerusalemite stone and things that rather seek to appropriate local Palestinians' mode of architecture as a way, right, of asserting one's belongingness to the land. So one can belong because one and the land are completely of the West, and one can belong because one and the land are completely from the East. But yes, but both of them, the question asked about how it enabled the colonization of Palestine and the dispossession of Palestinians, both of them did precisely the same.
Excellent, thank you. We have a few more questions. I'll give you two more. So Ari Dugnov, from a faculty member from GW, he says, thanks for a thoughtful discussion and a thought-provoking book. To play devil's advocate, a hawkish right-wing Zionist may argue that the syndrome or the complex you are dealing with is particular to labor Zionists and the Israeli left, such as Peace Now, who tried to separate 1967 from 1948 and thus distinguish themselves from the state's violence and the religious settlement movement, etc. This is a psychosis of the Israeli center, the right never suffered from. How would you respond to such an argument?
I'm not sure why it is playing devil advocate. I think this is part of what's at stake, right? So part of what's at stake is this effort to look precisely into this psychosis and look precisely into, right, the Israeli left insistence of creating these separations, but actually failing to do so. And what this does or fails to do or should do, right, to senses of selfhood and belonging and stuff. But the fact that the right does not suffer from this psychosis does not mean that the right does not fall into this very same structure, right? It just, the effectual relation to the structure of settlement is different. And part of, so I mostly focused on one part of the book, which talks precisely about this like figure or position of this like Peace Now Israeli leftist figure, but a third of the book deals with people from the right, explicitly settlers, and thinking about how they relate to the violence, how they relate to their acts of taking place, how they relate to the acts of settlement, and what are the mechanisms and apparatuses that are implemented by them, right, in their effort to justify their own project. And I agree that they are different, right? They precisely do not rely on this 48-67 separation, for example. But they are at place as well, right? So they too would need to employ, one of the things I'm looking at, so to stop being so abstract, one of the things I'm looking at is organic agriculture, right? And this like, this particular mode of relation to the land and to animals and to plants and to nature, right, as something that allows to think together, not to hide violence, right? Because again, like what I said to Libby about the truth, I don't think this is what is at stake, right? So it's not about hiding violence, but it's about creating a scheme of meaning that allows the self to be in, to live in violence. And I think this is at stake for both the right and the left. I'm not fully sure, Arya, I answered your question. So if you have a follow-up, just let me know.
I think it sounded wonderful. It was very convincing to me. So I'll go on to the next question. This is from Shira Robinson. She says, thanks so much, Hagar and Libby. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. It strikes me that there are two different ways that Israeli society needs to be decolonized. One is through the law, and the other is through emotion and a cultural reckoning. I don't know if you address the legal question in your book, but do you think that the cultural reckoning needs to come before the legal or structural one?
I will add a third one though, before I answer this question. I think there needs to be like some form of material redistribution. It's like doing this in Zoom gives jet lag a whole new meaning, because but anyway, there is a material redistribution that needs to take place as well, right? Land was stolen, houses were taken and repopulated, one needs to think, right, how these are being redivided in the land so that we do not change the legal, right? So democratization, right, equality vis-a-vis the law, but leave intact the material inequality, without which legal equality means very little, as Marx has taught us. So there is the material, there is the legal, and indeed there is the cultural and emotional. I don't know what should come first. I think it's kind of a vicious circle, right? So we need one in order to have the other. I would say that it needs to be a dialectical process, right? One needs to move a bit, to move the other a bit, to move the other a bit, or maybe it needs to be, actually, I'm saying this and I'm immediately disagreeing with myself. It should be maybe a revolution in which all of them happen at one and the same time. I don't know how to do this. Particularly because I think the emotional and the cultural are so essential to this decolonization. I don't know how one has a policy making for emotional change among people. So I don't know how we do it concretely, but I think somehow they must reinforce each other.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from Ilana Feldman. She says, thanks for this great conversation. In the book, you describe your project as being about, quote, the intimacies of public wrongs, which I think is incredibly evocative. Maybe partly following on Ari's question, how are those intimacies differently experienced by people who recognize the wrongs and those who think that they were and are right?
I'm not sure one can answer this without further unpacking these categories, right? Because even those who are sure they're wrong think they're wrong in different ways. So to go back to Libby's question about undoing subjects, right? So some of the people would experience these intimacies as fully undoing themselves, right? As self-contradictory in what they provoke in terms of emotions, and some would find way to settle those, right, and consolidate those with who they think they are. But I think part of what the book tries to do and then to undo, right, is to begin with this idea that those who think they're wrong experience this conflictual relation to the self, conflictual relation to the modes of being at home, of who they are, not wanting to be, right, not wanting to be identified or to identify themselves with this violence, and these self-contradictions kind of work on their different levels of emotions. But part of what I want to say at the end is that in the vast majority of cases, they don't do the work that I would want them to do, as in completely undoing, right? So even these self-contradictory senses of self end up somehow being settled. And part of what I try to show in the book vis-a-vis this figure of Irit, who lives in a depopulated Palestinian house, is that when they're being settled, they've been settled by somehow fully inhabit more one's position as a violent person, or as a person who is very much immersed in or conditioned by violence. I think Ari Shavit's book is the most striking explanation of that, of how, because he's also right, he's also this figure of the left, the piece now, when he's being torn by his place in violence, and then eventually says, well, but this violence made me who I am, and thanks to this violence, I have my daughter here, and she goes to wherever she goes. I don't remember what she does. So I stand with the damned eventually. I think this is what he says about the massacre in Lydia. So eventually, all these self-contradictions end up somehow being settled. And on the other hand, there is the people in the right who are sure they're right, and who presumably do not experience these contradictions, right? They can be settled in their settlement. They can be settled as, right, a colonizing self. And yet what I try to show in the book is that in their case too, we see process of contradictions, right? That cannot fully allow this settled position. So and I think from these places, if one needs to find a solution, right, it would come from these contradictions at the end. So again, on the one hand, it's completely opposite, but on the other hand, eventually, both of them are both conflictual and not conflictual, though in different ways.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a follow-up question from Shira. She says, a second question. What role have Palestinian citizens of Israel played in forcing the Israeli Jewish left to reckon with their colonial and implicated subjectivities?
I think a lot. I don't want to reproduce this factor in which I say something and then I say the opposite. But I think but I'm going to do it nonetheless. So first of all, I think it came from the Palestinian the idea, right, that we can and should think of Israel as large as a settler colony, and to stop the separation between the 48 and the 67, and to not see 48 as a done deal, but as something that still requires a solution, came to a great extent from the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and of course also Palestinians in the occupied territories and in the diaspora all around. But at the same time, I think that what happened, if we look historically, and this is an argument made by Raif Zweig, who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, is precisely that when we look, at least when we look at the center left, right, at the Zionist left, rather than the radical left, what we see is that historically this insistence of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel to insert themselves within the Israeli public discourse has pushed Israel to exclude them further. So Raif's argument is that the Israeli nation-state law is a response to the growing equality of Palestinians in Israel. There was a need, right, to cordon them off in various ways. And when we look at the Israeli left, as in the center left, as in the Labour Party and like Yesh Atid and other centric, they support, right? They support these structures. And so I think, again, when we think of the left, we have different lefts to think of. And unfortunately, I think some of, and the vast majority of what used to be the Israeli left, when being confronted with this demand for justice by Palestinian citizens of Israel, who made it very clear, right, that this demand for justice is not just about doing something in the West Bank with those violent settlers, but doing something in Israel proper, right? This created further violent mechanisms within the state, right, to make sure that hierarchies are being maintained and preserved.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question from Sasha Kaplan. She says, so what is the solution? You mentioned moving away from the two-state solution to a one-state solution. Does that mean Jews living in a Palestinian state?
When I said moving away from like a two-state solution, it's not because I think we should move away from two-state solution. It's because I think reality has moved us away from two-state solution. There is now like no future that I see that allows the division of the land between the sea and the river to two states. The state of Israel made sure that this is not going to happen, and no one talks about it anymore, right? It's not something that is in the Israeli public discourse. So it's not that I'm advocating a one state, is that I'm saying the one state is already here, right? It's the reality, and now the question is, which kind of one state is it, right? Is it a one state that is based on military rule, or is it a one state that is based on equality and some justice? So how would this one state look like? What would be the divisions between Jews and Palestinians in the land? I don't think I can answer it, certainly not now. I think there are good programs out there that would allow us to think about this. Forms of divisions, right? And local authorities, for example, that would allow communities to live separately but together, though I'm not sure if we think about the need for an emotional and affectual and cultural change. I'm not sure what we want is the separation of communities. Maybe what we want is actually communities to live together. So it's not about advocating one solution over another. It's about recognizing that one solution is already what's at play and then thinking what it is that we want to do with it.
Thank you. I have perhaps a kind of quirky question. In the US, I've noticed, especially in email messages from university faculty, that at the bottom of the message, there's a sort of postscript that says, this university is, founded and built and constructed on land that used to be, that was the ancestral homeland of the XYZ Indian nation, right? Which has become very important, right? Basically recognizing that the land that these huge wealthy institutions are on was stolen from Native Americans. Is there any of that sort of similar messaging that comes from, I know it's probably much more difficult in that situation because it's individual homes and right, which is especially what you're talking about. But is there any of that sort of messaging going on?
There is some in the margins. But I guess, right, it's easy for a university in the US to say, right, we sit on a stolen land, because they don't think that they would be called to return the land. I think once this call comes back and once this gesture, which I think is an important gesture if it's a beginning of something, right? But if you say, I stole this land and I see that I stole it, therefore I'm great, I can move on. We did not do much, right? I stole this land and therefore I need to do something with the land that would give benefits to those I stole it from, right? Maybe not dismantle the university and give it back to indigenous communities, but find ways that the wealth of the university will then go and subsidize. I don't know, right? There are things one can do with this recognition of stolen land. In Israel, the demand to say, okay, if you stole it, please give it back to me is potentially much more direct. And so it's much more dangerous, right, for someone to say, I stole this house. And I think that in those moments, there are very few cases that I know of people who said, okay, I stole this house and therefore I give it back, or therefore I give it back to not to the person from which it was stolen, but to the community from which it was stolen. I make a kindergarten for Palestinian children in Ramle instead of living in this house. There are cases such as that, but I think we can count them on two, but probably one hand. The few other cases that we see is people who say, oh, I recognize that I stole it, but then refuse, right, the implication of this. So again, an example from the book, where I talk about these figures of, right, the leftist Zionist Jews who live in depopulated Palestinian homes, and there is an example from a documentary in which, like, a woman come to one of these houses, and the man is like so benevolent and great, and he really wants to hear her story, and he tells like her that he's been looking for her family because he recognizes that the house has been taken from a Palestinian family, and he failed to find them, and he's so happy that she found him and she found the house. And she says, okay, so how much does this house worth now? And he said, such and such, right? Millions of shekels. And that's it, right? This is where the discussion ends. What one would expect is that if there is a recognition that one's wealth is based on stealing other people's property, when these other people would come, you would share the wealth with them at the very least, if not go away and give them the wealth. But I think people are unwilling, unable, cannot do that. And so people rather entrench in this like this is now mine, the past is in the past, I recognize your suffering, but oh well, right? Which means that recognizing suffering becomes much more tricky, which means that we see much fewer gestures such as this, because there is more risk that they won't stay empty gestures.
Wonderful. I think we'll leave it with that. Thank you so much for your wonderful book and this wonderful discussion, Hagar. And thank you so much, Libby, for being such a generous discussant. Thanks everyone for joining us so much. In the chat earlier was posted the website where you will be able to find the recording of this event once it's up. And please join us for our next event, which will be November 4th, with Rebecca Stein to discuss her book, Screenshots, State Violence on Camera in Israel and Palestine. And please join me in thanking everyone. Thanks so much, Christian, also, who is our operations manager, who handles so much of the logistics as well. Thanks so much.